welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast, a special episode, not just because Mr. Moretta has joined me again to talk about many of our various conversations we've had. We've talked about Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, we've talked about LBJ a little bit, we've talked about Texas politics, we've talked about probably a couple other ones in there as well, too, the counterculture movement. I wanted to have you on to discuss the Vietnam War, but in particular, kind of where our focus should be. We're going to, throughout this conversation, probably mention some names that get brought up, whether it's certain administrations or certain individuals that probably had the most influence and impact into why we remember Vietnam, how we remember Vietnam. But for the audience out there listening who's going to be new to you, do you mind reintroducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. I'm Dr. John Moretta. I'm a college professor. I teach at Houston Community College, where I've been for 43 years. Hope to retire next year. We'll see. I've written several books and articles on a wide range of topics in Texas history, U.S. history. My last book was called The Hippies in 1960s History, where I looked at the counterculture through the decade of the 60s and hopefully challenged some stereotypes about the hippie movement and counterculture. I'm working on a book right now about the radicalization of Austin, Texas, which, as most of you may know, is considered to be a weird city par excellence in the United States. And that title, that vibe has started in the 60s, and Austin has maintained its status in that same capacity. It's the live music capital of the world. It's one of the most progressive, creative cities in the United States. And a lot of that has its origins in the 1960s. So that book should be out in late fall 2025.
Well, we're going to have you back on to discuss that one when it comes out for its release, but I wanted to get your opinion or thoughts on the Vietnam War. Obviously, what do you take away from it? I've always noticed that media has never really represented it properly. Mostly if we watch movies, it's not a movie that we won a war. It's not a movie that we lost a war. It's kind of leaves you feeling empty. Like, was it a win or a loss? And I feel like that's the only way it could be depicted based on obviously us not really shouldn't even be over there in the first place. It's kind of this one of those unexplainable ones.
Yeah, it was a mistake. In retrospect, men like Robert McNamara admitted it was a mistake in Fog of War, which is a brilliant documentary which everybody should watch. I'm sure you've seen it. Won Academy Awards for a lot of awards. Well done. When you look at the history of Vietnam, the Vietnam War for the United States, few Americans realize that was first of all, it was a civil war, right? That dates back well before World War II. Vietnam, first of all, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, right? Laos were all part of the French Empire. The French had been there since the 1830s. So it was a war of national liberation. It starts out as a war of national liberation to end colonialism, right? And during World War II, we had promised what was called the Viet Minh. Was Ho Chi Minh's anti-French organization to throw the French out. We had promised Ho Chi Minh that if he helped us, the United States, drive the Japanese out of Southeast Asia, that we would support him having his own independent country. Okay. Well, he kept his word. He was a close ally of the United States against the Japanese during World War II. War's over, and thus it begins, in the sense that Harry Truman, right, will renege, allow France to reclaim its colonial possessions in Southeast Asia. This is a part of the history of Vietnam that people don't realize or they forget about. And that is our presence in Vietnam starts in the late 1940s. Why did Truman allow the French de Gaulle to reclaim its colonial possessions? not just, of course, Southeast Asia. We're talking Algeria, North Africa. It was part of our larger Cold War policy. So Vietnam starts out and ends as an integral part of our overall Cold War policy of containment. Okay, the domino theory. You've heard of that. I'm sure listeners, audience knows what I'm talking about. So first thing you have to ask is, well, here's Truman, this period of time, roughly 1945, 46, 47, 48, putting tremendous pressure on Great Britain for them to relinquish their empire. Well, Churchill will slowly extricate Great Britain from its world dominance. But de Gaulle, was a horse of a different color, much more imperious, much more Napoleonic in his views of French power and hegemony. And so part of our Cold War strategy in Europe was to contain, obviously, Soviet expansion. In order to do that, we needed French support relative to Germany. Now, Germany's divided by 48. Germany is East Germany, West Germany. You reach a status quo in Europe. Truman believed in a very strong West Germany, even the possibility of rearming West Germany. Well, French would never go for that. So the deal that was struck between de Gaulle and Truman, and thus begins our presence in Vietnam, was that Truman said, okay, if you will support a strong West Germany, even a potential rearming if necessary, which never took place. We just sent massive troops via NATO to defend West Germany. I'll allow you to go back into Southeast Asia, back into Vietnam. Well, it begins. Ho Chi Minh felt betrayed, and rightly so, and told Truman straight up, if you allow the French to come back, reclaim my country, I will engage in a war of national liberation. I will drive them out. Truman justified his reneging with Ho Chi Minh because Ho Chi Minh was a Marxist. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Quote, communist. Really, but he was never a Soviet lackey. And remember, part of our containment policy, one of the flaws of our Cold War policy, is we saw every war of national liberation in the emerging nations after World War II, Third World, as all being Moscow directed, right? And this becomes especially intense 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when you had all over the globe, it seemed, these massive uprisings of wars of national liberation, especially in Africa. And so the Cold War is going to shift dramatically out of Europe to the Third World in those 3 decades, as the United States and the Soviet Union competed with each other to pick up new client states. Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, as predicted, the French will go back. The moment the French get there, the War of National Liberation begins. Ho Chi Minh will organize a guerrilla army, the Viet Minh, which eventually transformed to the Viet Cong, and will defeat the French. He will humiliatingly defeat the French. And this is all despite massive U.S. aid. No troops. Truman will pump billions of dollars into sustaining the French, propping up the French in Vietnam. Money, military hardware, planes, tanks, etc. Well, this is a guerrilla warfare in jungles. Tanks and planes aren't going to do you a damn bit of good. And eventually, Ho Chi Minh simply wears the French out. The French are humiliatingly defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1950, 54. And de Gaulle realized what a fiasco. The war in France became very unpopular. And de Gaulle, like our presidents, will push the French people to support the war. But the French people said, no, we're done. We barely survived World War II. Now we're going to be fighting in Algeria in a few more years. They don't know that yet. In North Africa, we just got crushed in Vietnam despite U.S. support, right? So our connection, our presence in Vietnam, people don't understand this. They see the Vietnam War. The popular view of the Vietnam War is it's the 1960s. No, our presence, our war in Vietnam begins with the Truman administration almost immediately after World War II. Let's make matters worse. Let's fast forward to 1954, the Geneva Conference. Okay. Now, Truman's gone. He did not seek a re-election. Okay. Cold War battered Truman. He had the fall of China in 1949. And that's another connection with Vietnam. This is when the domino theory begins. The fall of China to Mao Zedong and the communists in 1949 was a death blow to the Truman administration, to our Cold War policy. A year later, you've got Korea, which puts it is like the final nail in poor Harry Truman's coffin. All right. But the fall of China terrified Americans. I mean, just sent them into the atmosphere as far as fear. Because now all of a sudden, you've got two largest nations on the planet, Russia, Soviet Union, and China, are red. Okay. The most populous and geographically the largest nations. So you see this red menace descend, this iron curtain, as Churchill referred to it, descending down upon the world. So our containment policy, which Truman announced in 1947, was to prevent the spread of communism. Well, back to Vietnam. When China falls, the automatic U.S. assumption, oh my God, they will help spread communism in Southeast Asia with Vietnamese support. Well, no one bothered to pick up, being facetious, but no one bothered to pick up an Asian history book. And all you had to do is read a few chapters to realize that you couldn't find two greater enemies in this region of the world than Southeast Asia, Vietnamese, Laotians, Cambodians, and the Chinese. And they hate each other. And if you look at the history of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, there had been constant invasions into that region by the Chinese that were repelled by the Southeast Asians. So the myth that Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh were going to become bosom buddies and spread communism throughout the rest of the region, that was a myth. Part of the myth of the domino theory. Then back to my original premise is that one of the biggest flaws of our Cold War policy from beginning to end of the Cold War. So you're looking Truman to Reagan, for God's sake. I can give you 9 million examples, which you don't need because you have a good sense of history, and most of your viewers do. But every time there was a war of national liberation, I don't pick any damn part of the world, the U.S. assumption is either Beijing directed or Moscow directed or both, which was rarely the occasion. These were wars of national liberation to free countries from European or U.S. imperialism or European colonialism. And there were moments when JFK realized this. This was all part of his flexible response of his foreign policy, whereby, look, the struggle for liberation in these developing countries is not, yes, it could be it is part of a larger Cold War dynamic involved here, but it doesn't necessarily mean these countries are going to fall to communism. And the best way to, this is JFK speaking, best way to prevent them from falling to communism is to come to their aid, not with tanks, but with tractors, symbolically speaking. Because what these countries need is you can't eat a tank, but you sure as hell could eat a tractor. They need massive aid. His Peace Corps, you know the Peace Corps, was an example of this, right? And so back to Vietnam, it's all tied to these to a larger picture, which I think you know. With Vietnam, once Truman, well, the Eisenhower administration, I'm sorry, Geneva Conference. In 1954, you have the Geneva Conference, whereby you bring together the United States, France, Great Britain, Soviet Union, etc., to decide the future fate of Vietnam. Okay. Well, it was agreed at the Geneva Conference that Vietnam would be temporarily divided. If you ever noticed, when the superpowers didn't know what to do with the country, you just drew a line and divided it. East Germany, West Germany, North Korea, South Korea. Well, hell, it works there. Let's do it in Vietnam. At Geneva, Ho Chi Minh felt betrayed once again by the United States. And at Geneva, Ho Chi Minh told Eisenhower, look, you want to stop the spread of Red China, Communist China, and its influence in the rest of Asia? I'm your man. We have a long-standing enmity with the Chinese. I promise you, China will never dominate Southeast Asia. Well, Eisenhower, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. You're a Marxist. I'm sorry. So you divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. That was the final straw for Ho Chi Minh. Again, betrayed by the United States. And so, but at Geneva, it was stipulated that in 2 years' time, a national referendum would be held whereby the Vietnamese people would be able to vote to decide not just to unify their country, but if they wanted to unify their country, and to elect their president. Well, between 54 and 56, we make some serious mistakes. Ho Chi Minh and his followers will go to North Vietnam, right? 17th parallel, above the 17th parallel. United States, in the meantime, will install a prince called Bao Dai. You may have heard of him. Old Mandarin class, ruling class, dating back to French colonialism. He becomes the leader of Vietnam, Bao Dai. And in that interval, 54 to 56, United States, Eisenhower, in order to prop up the ability of South Vietnam to survive potentially as an independent country, will pour lots of military aid and money into Vietnam, right? And we will continue to, in effect, rule Vietnam as a puppet country through its Mandarin class, which is Francophile, and even allow a lot of the French who stayed, we asked them to stay because they could help administer the country. This is Eisenhower, right? So you still have the French ruling classes in alliance with the Mandarin class, the upper class Vietnamese. They're all Francophiles, and even more devastating, they're Catholic, hardcore Catholics. The rest of the 90% of the country is Buddhist, which is going to be a problem later on. And so here we are, Eisenhower propping it up with hardware, military hardware, money. But Ike, smart man. If you want to single out a president who had the best policy relative to Vietnam, it was Eisenhower. Eisenhower refused, was intransigent, refused, even though Dulles and those guys push. no troops, no U.S. troops. When I left office in 61, the United States had maybe, we don't know exactly, plus or minus about 500 or less U.S. advisors, military advisors in South Vietnam. All right. Now, 1956, the year rolls around, election time. Well, it was clear to the Eisenhower administration, and there's tons of documentation, even Ike publicly will come out and say, no, we're not going to have, the elections will not be held. Because if they were held, Ho Chi Minh would have won hands down. I mean, it would have been a rout. He's very popular, well liked by the Vietnamese people. They see him as a national leader, a nationalist, not a Marxist. They see him as a nationalist. And so we renege again and declare to the world that Vietnam, like Korea, we keep it in an Asian context, will be permanently divided at the 17th parallel. Well, Ho Chi Minh is thoroughly alienated. He's pissed. Now the problems begin. In South Vietnam, they'll emerge what's called the Viet Cong. You've heard of them. Okay. These will be South Vietnamese who were supporters of Ho Chi Minh. We will label them as communist.
Well, really, it's Vietnamese nationalism is what we're labeling communism.
Precisely. Very good. You got it. Exactly. And we will do this around the world, not just in Vietnam. Okay. Everywhere.
If it doesn't look like our form of democracy, we'll paint it with this communist brush.
Precisely. And that's, again, another serious shortcoming, flaw of our Cold War policy. I mean, we look at this in retrospect. At the time, everybody bought into it. Christ, everybody in the United States, most everybody.
It made me wonder because if you really think of the leader on that front would have been probably J. Edgar Hoover with influencing so many people with either false information or scare tactics, certain members in office. He couldn't control the battle at home. I would say, in my opinion, the Vietnam War really kind of came to this breaking point at home with the counterculture movement. And I think that really stopped.
Anti-war movement, yeah.
Yeah, I think it really put people to their senses because I think everybody in the beginning, nobody really bothered or didn't really resist the Vietnam War. They were kind of in support of it. Like if it got brought up on the street, they're like, oh, yeah, we're doing whatever, stopping communists.
Yeah, exactly. Even as late as 68, Robbie, you had the majority of college students. New York Times, I just read this part of my book. New York Times, Seymour Lipset had written several articles in defense of U.S. policy, but also accurately portrayed that most college students by 68 still supported our president, still supported the Vietnam War. Or even worse, most college students couldn't find goddamn Vietnam on a map.
Well, I spoke with Abe Peck of the Chicago Seed, one of those counterculture magazines. His only thing that he supported doing, like he regretted a lot of the counterculture stuff that he did do, but the one thing that he really supported was the fact that he was anti-Vietnam. And I think a lot of people still maintain that belief now. I think that's why the counterculture, the hippie movement might have migrated, but I think a lot of those old heads kind of still believe on that same factor that was just one of those disasters that we should have never been involved in.
Oh, I agree with Abe 100%. Most of my generation does. I mean, if you're educated, if you're well informed, you're not a low information voter. You can read between the lines.
I think even with my generation, we're just largely so disconnected because it's our grandparents that either served or great grandparents for some people. But I know friends of mine that their parents served. They hate it. They hate it with a burning passion because their parents, when they came back, were just different, not like how they used to be. And again, you mentioned something about Eisenhower, the around 500, give or take, people that were still remaining yeah, advisors that were over there. John McCone, the director of the CIA at a point, made a statement later about Kennedy, and Kennedy speaking to him about what his policy was going to be when it came to troop involvement in the U.S. Because obviously, it's one of these long questions: was he going to pull troops out? Was he going to keep troops in or escalate the war? And he said that John McCone stated that Kennedy told him that he was going to reduce the level of people in Vietnam to the level that Eisenhower originally had, which was when he left, I guess. And it's funny because I took that and then I heard what George Reedy, who was an advisor to LBJ, said in an interview. And he says that LBJ, when he got the position, went into a room filled with half Kennedy people and half Johnson people. The Kennedy people were looking at Johnson at what is the next thing to do. And Johnson was looking at the Kennedy people as what's the next move to do. And he said, since at this point, Kennedy was putting troops in Vietnam, that he was going to continue doing that, not to step on toes of the Kennedy administration people that he was trying to lure into his side. And I was like, there's the disconnect. He ramped it up when really he didn't even talk to Kennedy about what he was planning on doing, because Kennedy only associated with Bobby because he could trust nobody in his administration.
That's exactly correct. And he should have leaned more heavily on Johnson. And because Johnson, particularly on his domestic policies, but that's kind of a different.
Well, he was the only, I mean, as much as people give him crap, Johnson, I only say like he's probably the one that we needed to get civil rights bills passed. Because at that point, whether he was doing it just to maintain JFK's memory, he might have said some horrible derogatory things on the phone in his private time, but he was really about like, I'm going to get this done. I know who this goes towards, and I'm going to make sure this happens.
Oh yeah, he was brilliant. He was brilliant, Johnson. I mean, he will use Kennedy's assassination. He'll make the United States. I mean, you can probably ask your parents or your grandparents. I don't know how old your parents are, but Johnson, while we're on the topic momentarily, Johnson brilliantly exploited the sense of guilt and shame the American people felt with JFK's assassination. I mean, guy murdered in broad daylight, for Christ's sake, but with some kind of conspiracy, and God knows who the conspirators are. But it was definitely not Lee Harvey by himself. Or
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it was not us. Well, nobody in the right mind believes that. I promise you.
Yeah, Doug Horn just went to the second JFK hearing. He was like, in what world does a lone nut, or where a lone nut is involved with killing the president, that the autopsy was changed 4 times in 2 weeks? And I was like, it kind of sets the record. Somebody's doing something. I believe LBJ is part of the cover-up, but I've just heard too many things like you're stating. So many phone calls with Bill Moyers, people that were either involved in the Kennedy administration, like Kenny O'Connell, Kenny O'Donnell, and then you have Larry O'Brien, then you have so many others that were crucial to JFK, Ted Sorensen, people that love JFK, and he was like, look, I don't want Kennedy's memory to be thrown to the wayside. We got to do something, and I need you, in honor of Kennedy. And it's like, dude, you know what you're doing. They know what you're doing. It's not good looking, but he thought he could smooth, and he did. He coerced a lot of people. It might have changed their minds. They might have grown a closer relationship with him in office, but he exploited JFK's death pretty quickly.
Oh, he was brilliant at it. And he knew that he had to seize that moment. If he didn't, he would lose the Civil Rights Initiative on 64 and then 65. 65 is a little different, but 64, he needed it. That bill was in Congress by time of JFK's assassination, and it was just being hacked up by the Southern states' rights, the Dixiecrats and such. And LBJ is going to take that out, revise it, and push it through. But anyway, you want to stick with Vietnam still?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So anyway, Ginny, you don't have the elections. Now the war begins. Eisenhower will continue to pump in a lot of aid. No troops, right? But Eisenhower, even though he's a military guy, he's a World War II conventional war kind of guy. So the aid we are giving ARVN is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which we will create. Vietnamese soldiers, South Vietnamese, right? Will be supplied with conventional weaponry, helicopters, tanks, planes, etc. Well, this was a guerrilla war, right? Modern technology is not going to be very effective in those jungles. That's why we'll resort to that horrible process of defoliation, which you know what that is. Once we get frustrated with our inability to invite a conventional war. And I also remember something else. And I think I knew this. He's not stupid, Eisenhower. The, the Vietnamese had been fighting a guerrilla warfare type of warfare for centuries against all the invaders of their country. That's why they prevailed. And we're going to get beat militarily by these little men. I'm going to use a term that we use, little men running around in black pajamas. This is a guy who has an AK-47, a sack full of rice, a couple grenades, sandals on his feet, lightweight, quote, looking pajamas. We're going to get our ass kicked by this guy. And then when you throw in the NVA, North Vietnamese Army, you got problems. Now, the Viet Minh will transform into the Viet Cong. And this will be a force in South Vietnam, aided by Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam, 50s into the 60s, into the 70s, right? That wants to overthrow the Saigon government. Saigon government is propped up by the United States. And here comes mistake number 55. The men we will put in power in South Vietnam, the Keys, the Twos, the DMs, the list goes on, were nothing but brutal military dictators. Hardcore anti-communists, hardcore Catholics who alienated their own people. I will leave, right? The conflict is raging, but it's contained in South Vietnam. The American people don't even know where Vietnam is. I mean that not literally, but it's not on the public radar. It won't be for quite some time.
It's go ahead and do it because I can't see it.
Yeah, exactly. So Ike knows, I think all I've read with Eisenhower, he knows this could blow up in our face. And that's why it's why he never committed US troops. He knew, because of Korea, that the United States, as powerful as it was, could never win any kind of land war in Asia. He knew that. That's why he ended Korea. So this is a disaster. Disaster. Let's go back to the status quo, 38th parallel, finished. So he got us out. My appreciation for Eisenhower grows as I get older, of those post-World War II presidents. I'm no big fan of Ike relative to civil rights. The guy was a racist and stuff. But when it came to international diplomacy, foreign policy, he's one of the better ones of the post-war era.
I think you develop that view when you learn a little bit more about their conservative values and kind of as you get older, that conservative starts to, not saying you are, but it becomes more prominent on certain factors. More old school Democrat would be identified today, probably.
Yeah, I'm old school Democrat. I am old school. Exactly. It's a great way to define me. Old school liberal Democrat. But anyway, so Kennedy's elected, right? Kennedy, as you know, you're a Kennedy scholar. During the campaign, he came across, he felt compelled to, I think, to beat Nixon as a hardcore Cold Warrior. Talked about alleged missile gap and all the things we were going to do, etc. And he wins, barely, but he wins. Okay. Now he's got to deliver the goods. Okay. Kennedy believed, and I mentioned this earlier briefly, he took the Eisenhower administration to task during the campaign, which really meant Nixon. Remember, Nixon was the one who planned the Bay of Pigs, not Kennedy. Kennedy's mistake was to authorize it. Jesus. Anyway, so one of the flaws that Kennedy realized about American 1950s policy, it was very rigid. We had one response, which John Foster Dulles said, massive retaliation. If the Soviets move anywhere in the world, we'll threaten them with a massive retaliation of our missiles. Well, not stupid. We sure as hell didn't do that in Hungary. We didn't do that in other places. It was just tough talk. And we got away with it for a while in 50, because remember, Stalin dies in 53. So you got a power struggle in the Kremlin. The time Khrushchev takes power, 56, right? Then you got some stability. Then the Soviets contest how legitimate is this massive retaliation nonsense. Okay. Well, Kennedy criticized Nixon, Eisenhower administration, for lacking what he called a flexible response. And he's correct. Kennedy's correct. He goes, look, we're so locked into this myopic view of massive retaliation that we can't deal with these brand new exigencies that are popping up all over the third world. The tractor versus the tank. If this is where the Cold War geopolitically will shift, beginning in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And Kennedy says, we cannot win these countries to our side if we're either for them or against them. They're either for us or against us. Kennedy says, if they want to be non-aligned, which a lot of these emerging nations wanted to be, then we can say that's okay, but we can win them over. We'll give them the tractors. We want economic development. You can't eat a missile. Flexible response. Transfer this mentality to Vietnam. Kennedy says, look, we're not going to defeat the Viet Cong, the communist, in South Vietnam with tanks, missiles, aircraft. We must have the appropriate flexible military response, which is called counterinsurgency. Thus, Kennedy and his advisors develop our ability, or tried to, our ability to put down this new type of warfare, guerrilla warfare, insurgency, the little men in pajamas, with our own ability to fight that way. Hence, special forces development during Kennedy's administration, the Green Berets, his most legendary, and others. This is where the war, if we're going to fight, the hot wars are not going to be between us and the Soviets. No, that's not going to happen, particularly after Cuba Missile Crisis, right? The wars now are going to be geopolitically fought in these emerging nations, the third world. We must have the appropriate flexible response to meet these new exigencies, contingencies. We must develop our ability to fight this kind of warfare. And he will pump millions of money into developing our special forces, the Green Beret, right? So this is who we'll send over to Vietnam. Well, JFK was correct. There's no doubt about it in that sense. But the problem is, you're going to train a young man in the art of guerrilla warfare, right? In 16 weeks, 13 to 16 weeks, send him over to those jungles to fight an individual who has been fighting this type of warfare for centuries in his own home turf jungles. We're not going to win.
I think you just revealed something to me on an LBJ phone call. I was trying to understand where he was going with it. He was talking to Robert McNamara, and he explained to him, he was kind of yelling at him, but he was like, what you're going to go here and do is you're going to get these boys through school. You're going to have them go through their years of school, and you're going to send them over there. And then what happens if they don't want to fight? What are you going to do? Are you going to pick up a gun and are you going to go fight for them? You know, he was talking to McNamara in that sense. And if we really talk about McNamara's influence on JFK and his policies, I wonder if they were talking about the Green Berets, the training, having these people go over there, then realize that they're kind of fighting an unwinnable war. Then what are you going to do with all the time and resources you just spent?
Precisely. The war cost, we wasted trillions. I mean, in today's dollar value, it'd be trillions.
Because I think LBJ, a lot of people like say that he wanted the war, that's why he increased the troop involvement. I was like, I think he was really trying to maintain what legacy points and voting points he was going to be getting for carrying on some things that Kennedy was assumed that he was doing without these kind of backdoor conversations and passing of certain things. Apparently, like, what is it, NSAM 63 that he signed. I haven't found the signature or anything on it. It's just word of mouth by certain individuals that stated he was going to. Look, I believe that. I like to believe that Kennedy was on his way to just pulling out things with, I don't know. But
Yeah, no,
with LBJ, I think if you examine him, most of his phone calls are, "What is a damn mess did you guys get me into?" And it was just beating him down the whole time. Most of his administrational phone calls are about Vietnam.
yes, he was consumed by it eventually, and he hated the war. He hated that war. He knew Johnson was a smart guy. He knew that war would be his death knell, literally, physically, symbolically, politically, policy wise. He knew it, and that's why he ramrodded all those great policies through as quick as he could. He said, "I ain't got a timetable here, man, before this war catches up." He did not want that war, but he said, "I cannot pull out. I don't want to be the first president to ever lose a war." And I, with Johnson, I really put the burden, the fault on McNamara, Rusk, Watt, Rostow, McBundy, his wise men, the generals, Westmoreland, Jesus, Earl Wheeler, all those guys. They led him down the wrong path, right? Kennedy, back to Kennedy, he will start to escalate. Our troop escalation begins with JFK. You know that. Time of JFK's assassination, 63, you're looking at about 16 to 17,000 U.S. troops. And LBJ and Kennedy still telling the American people, telling the press, "Oh, they're just advisors. Please give me a break. They're not advisors. We're fighting." You got American troops have already died as early as 62. Not very many, but several, right? Initially, we were on search and destroy with Arvin. But that's the other problem people don't realize is that once you started sending U.S. troops over, American arrogance is going to start to push aside Arvin. And we're going to say to these Vietnamese troops, "Listen, man, you obviously can't defeat these people. Step aside, son. Let a real man do it. I'm trained in this." And the Arvin guys, because, "Hey, be my guest. You can go out in those jungles if you want. You can get your ass kicked." And they were right. And so, in many ways, our troop presence will become a very demoralizing factor for Arvin. By the time you get to the end of that war, 70, if not earlier, Arvin is not fighting the war at all. They're not doing anything. We're fighting the war. We've so demoralized with our arrogance and failure to appreciate what they've been doing. And the demoralized, and the corruption. Oh my God, the corruption was just widespread everywhere. Saigon was Sin City. Anything you want, you could buy in Saigon. And so the other problem you have but back to Kennedy, is that he's going to lie. So the deceit, the lies begin with JFK, right? He will tell the American people, "No, American troops are not fighting. We're still there advising and assisting, blah, blah, blah." Lie. And then he tells one of the biggest whoppers of all toward the end of his administration. And the press is starting, U.S. media, the press is starting to get, wait a minute. You start to CBS, NBC, ABC, the big news networks start to send guys over there. This is when Dan Rather and those guys start to make a name for themselves.
We started getting serious reporting, like the napalm girl covered in napalm running through the fire.
Well, that's a little later. But even earlier than that, the press is saying, "Wait a minute." Because a lot of times these guys would actually go with U.S. troops, right, into combat or with Arvin, in conjunction with Arvin. And they said, "Wait a minute, no, this is not happening. We're actually fighting the war." Well, in just August or September of 63, so a few months before JFK is killed, so the press is saying, "Well, Mr. President, we've witnessed events in Vietnam, South Vietnam, that completely contradict what you're telling us. We've seen American soldiers go into combat. You're saying they're not. We've seen American soldiers get wounded or die, and you're saying that they're not. Wait a minute, there's a disconnect here, and that's only going to get worse. But one of the biggest whoppers he tells is no, 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 no. Those troops are over there to help the Vietnamese with their flood control problems. The press, flood control. Yes, every year the monsoons come and they flood Vietnam and cause massive destruction, etc. American people say, oh, yeah, floods, oh, yeah. Well, I got news for you, and you probably know this. I'm sure your audience does. If those monsoons don't come in the late summer, fall months in that part of the world, those people will starve to death. And the naivete of Americans in accepting this was just, in retrospect, is like, what? And this is the kind of bill of goods Kennedy sold, and he got away with it. Now, what's going to kind of contravene that a little bit will be the self-immolation of the Buddhist monks. That's the first real symbolic moment for the American people. When the American people saw on the nightly news in newspapers and magazines these monks sitting down in downtown Saigon, pouring gasoline on themselves and lighting themselves on fire, Americans say, whoa, what's this? Well, for some about to tell white America, the same thing's happening in Alabama and Mississippi to your own citizens. But that's a different issue. But that really kind of started to freak Americans out because they did not like seeing that. Well, no, 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 no. So the questions begin. Now, make it matters worse a little bit for Kennedy. We have a revolving door in South Vietnam of dictators, presidents. They're all dictators. Diem, who overthrew Bao Dai, takes control, 56, 57, and he is brutal. He's a Francophile, refuses to speak his own language, speaks only French, hardcore Catholic. The Buddhist monks are protesting, right? His wife, Madame Diem, call it the big barbecue. And this is when Kennedy says, well, what the hell's going on over there? So based on CIA, based on his trusted advisors he sends over there, they're going to come home and tell him, Mr. President, the real problem right now is leadership in South Vietnam. This guy, Diem, is nothing but a brutal dictator. And they are correct, right? A lot of our problems will go away if Diem is removed. So Kennedy will sanction his removal. But he tells the CIA and the ARVN generals opposed to Diem, look, do whatever you must do. It's a coup. Remove him from office. Put him on a plane. I'll set him up on the French Riviera. De Gaulle has agreed to take him in, and we'll put somebody else in there new. I want no harm done to this man. Well, as you know, the coup is put into effect. Diem is whisked away, right? On the way to the airport, van stops. Diem and his family get out of the van. I think they're getting on the plane, and they are murdered right there, assassinated, the whole family killed. Kennedy hears this. He is livid. This is when he purges the CIA again, held them responsible. And it probably was their fault in conjunction with the generals. And so he purges the CIA. This event, all of a sudden, to the best of my knowledge, reading conversations, etc., is when this is what gave Kennedy second thoughts. Whoa, what are we doing? We have not pacified the countryside. We have massive protests by Buddhists. The Vietnamese people, South Vietnamese people, are turning against us. Maybe it's time to reconsider what we're doing in this place. And so, rumor has it, I mean that facetiously, that JFK was seriously contemplating pulling us out.
I
Or
believe that.
huh?
I believe that.
Yeah, I
I just,
think
with the historical record, I think it's just best to, he died and it didn't get to happen. So I think that should be written down. But I think we have to go based on what was accomplished. Again, this whole what if scenario, and people do that. Same thing with like Bobby Kennedy. I think he would have been great for president. You know how many people wanted him to be president?
oh my
That was,
God, he would have won.
yeah, well, he did, but he's assassinated. But he was. I think this. That's where their kind of thing ends. I mean, we can play the whole alternate reality if he would have lived type scenario, but I'm just trying to like for the historical record. I'm looking at what was said, when was it said, and what was documented, and again the contractor agreement of pulling out troops just comes from a word of mouth type thing where a guy said he had a meeting with Kennedy and next thing you know he was deciding to pull out troops. I'm like, did he sign anything? Did he make an order? Did any of that go through? And it's like it didn't go through.
There are memos where this is discussed, which you can access, right? Kennedy Library of Congress. There are memos between him, not Westmoreland, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Who was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs?
Oh,
It wasn't Westmoreland. He was, oh God.
Skip it. It'll come back to you.
Yeah, it'll come back. The only one that was adamant was the Air Force guy who was adamant about maintaining. Oh, LeMay, Curtis.
Oh, Curtis LeMay. Oh, I was going to say that, but I thought that was wrong.
No, LeMay eventually become chairman of the Joint Chiefs, but LeMay, hardcore, he wanted to bomb the shit out of Vietnam, etc. Right, but no. Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I knew it would come back. Thank you. Was saying, Mr. President, we need to consider this. So he had support from that. George Ball, was very strongly opposed. Mr. President, get out. Senator Fulbright, get out, Mr. President. Even Richard Russell, was saying, what? He'll tell LBJ, get out. This is going to kill your administration.
I love his relationship with LBJ. I didn't know, but there's always these things like obviously the main one that people point to when you're talking about the Kennedy stuff is when the 29th, when LBJ calls Richard Russell and tells him, I don't want to have to stick the FBI on you, but you're goddamn going to serve. Because Richard Russell was like, I don't want to do it. I don't want to work with Earl Warren was really his whole thing.
He hated him.
He called him 5 times that day before that phone call. He called him almost every day afterwards. He called him up from the 24th, basically. LBJ was denying doing a Warren commission. He didn't want one. He wanted to go off the FBI report. But every time people kept bringing it up, this needs to happen. But his relationship with Richard Russell was just extended over farther than I guess what people really kind of realize.
And goes back to the 50s.
Yeah, because when there's a phone call like in the 64 or something like that, and he's talking about Vietnam, and he's like, I don't really feel like getting involved in this whole thing. LBJ saying that, and Richard Russell's like, yeah, I guess that's payback for the Warren Committee. Like he's stating like you're getting your comeuppance for making me have to do something I didn't want to do, and that's very revealing because obviously with LBJ, I think where you have to analyze him is. He wanted to be a president that could handle all the domestic problems when it came to press reporting, when it came to things that were like moving things along in his own personal thing. But it's a war that he's disconnected from. He can't see it. He can only send troops. He's getting press reports where he's asking his advisors, is this true, the number of people that were killed by this? They say you're bombing bicycles. Are you telling me you're putting bombs on women and children? What are they doing? And the guy's like, they're fighting as well, too. And he's just like, so is the press story accurate? Like, I need to know because I'm going to go out there and talk and I want to make sure. And this is something I don't know if you know this, but I just discovered it today, actually. I guess we all kind of figure. But he was talking to Richard Helms
Hmm.
And he was telling him the unspoken rule that when I'm sitting on my ranch and I'm no longer president, you will keep me informed of what is going on. He goes, I promise you no press leaks, but I need to be informed on somewhat of what is going on in the current administration's power. And he goes, make sure you get authority to tell me that, which means that Richard Nixon, the current president, would have to go. You have to ask him if you can pass this on to LBJ. He goes, I did this for Truman. I did it for Eisenhower. He goes, they've all kind of been involved in this little thing and we want to keep it going. So if you can inform me, then go and inform Eisenhower, then go and inform Truman. I did like, I guess we all suspect they must be coordinating something, but they were really, so if they were interviewed on their ranch or something, they would be knowledgeable about some of the questions and what the current administration's doing. Like it was an all smart decision, but really it was just inside information.
Inside information. And Nixon was not good at sharing, but Eisenhower was shared, Truman shared until he died, of course. Uh, but no, Nixon was very secretive, very secretive. I mean, he would chat with LBJ occasionally. There's some conversations they do have because LBJ was there at president's creation. I mean, Vietnam becomes LBJ's war, and Nixon was aware of his experiences. But anyway, back to DM. He's assassinated. That's the big blow, and Kennedy's going to pull us out. The rumor has it. I think he would have, or at least begin to de-escalate. But we'll never know. Kennedy's killed. What? DM's killed in October. Kennedy's killed in November of '63. LBJ inherits the war. Okay, now the war becomes America's war. It really does, because so many things happen. It's like the perfect storm with Johnson. First of all, media, television becomes much more aggressive in filming the war. You have technology, right? You can send tapes, and they can be initially they're played the next day. A lot of times they're going to be played by the late '60s that night. You can film a battle in the day over there, and you'll have the newsreel at that night. And that's once you put that war on television, it's all over because the American people are just not going to accept it.
I want to ask.
I mean,
Well, I want to ask this. It's kind of a sidetrack, but I don't know if you've ever heard this, but Nixon apparently avoided or did not confirm a situation where a peace talk could have been initiated with North Vietnam because of the fact he was waiting till he was elected to
oh
gain
yeah,
credit for it. That's true because
that's
there's
true.
yeah, there's two phone calls, and one of the it's like a 15-minute phone call with Nixon that I've been slowly dissecting. And the main description is Nixon discusses Everett Dirksen's call about Nixon's associates encouraging South Vietnam not to join peace talks. Says he will cooperate with LBJ. LBJ calls him and he's like, I need to talk to you about a couple of things. And then Richard Nixon's kind of like, okay, what do you need from me? He's like, what are you saying to the press when you make a statement? Because he's been telling Hubert Humphreys, who's running for election, to not mention any of this stuff about NAM. Keep NAM out of your mouth. We don't want anything that's going to end up being something we have to go follow up with later. And Nixon's going out there talking about Vietnam in certain situations. And then that's when this peace talk thing arises. And it was a theory, I think, for a lot of people have put it forward, but I think it's well confirmed now that there's evidence that Nixon could have easily created a peace talk between South Vietnam, and he decided to delay it till he was elected.
Exactly. He used it. He told everybody no, do delay, postpone, undermine the peace talks. Johnson was finally became aware of it, but by the time he becomes aware of that, he's so beaten down. He's so demoralized.
I mean, for God's sakes, he's in interviews taking like nitroglycerin pills like every 5 minutes because he's about to have a massive heart attack.
Well, he dies in '73. He dies, what, 4 years after he leaves the White House, the poor man. Jesus God, poor LBJ, just beat to death. Anyway, so LBJ is going to escalate. But remember, with the escalation with Johnson, he is literally going to turn the entire Vietnam War over to his wise men. That's what he referred to McNamara, Rusk, Bundy, Rostow, the experts. You handle this war. I will support it, whatever you think is best in the U.S. interest. I want to focus on my domestic agenda. I want to make the great society real. And by God, he almost pulled it off, right? And civil rights, all the bills that have been destroyed, beginning with Reagan down to Trump, education. If you look at the current assault on all those government entitlement programs by the Trump administration, these are the final legacies of Johnson's Great Society, whether it's a SNAP program or pick one, right? USAID, that began with Kennedy. Um, but so many of these programs that the Trump administration's putting in its final dismantling. Well, it began before that, right? It began with Reagan and kind of slowed down with Clinton and Obama, but now it's ramped up again. But anyway, Johnson, when you look at Johnson in the war, to me, the biggest fault of Johnson's is he didn't want to face it head on, take control of it, win it, lose it, end it, whatever. He still had a Cold War mentality. He believed in the domino theory, but he would say that publicly. Americans were still buying it. But I think Johnson knew in his heart of hearts that this war is not winnable, even though he wants to believe it's winnable. He's being told it's winnable. He's being told until 1967 that the war is winnable. Who's telling me this? Westmoreland, McNamara, Rusk, Bundy, Rostow, the wise man.
Abe Fortas.
Yeah, Abe Fortas. Yeah, they were very close. Abe Fortas.
Well, he helped Abe get on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, he sure as hell did. And the other thing that people don't realize of Johnson is that his foreign policy knowledge, Kennedy was a foreign policy wonk. I mean, like big time. That was his expertise. Johnson's the complete flip side. Johnson was not stupid, but that was not his expertise. That was not his forte. Domestic policy had been ever since he was elected to Congress in 38, elected to the House, right? So that's why he turned the war over, right? But the problem is he should have kept Harry Truman's little motto on his desk: "The buck stops here." Well, Mr. President, the buck stops here with everything, not just domestic policy, but foreign policy. And he made a mistake. Now, McNamara and those guys, McNamara, if you watch Fog of War, will take full responsibility for the fiasco. He admits it several times in that documentary. It's brilliant. In fact, he breaks down and cries several times. And he says, "Don't blame Lyndon Johnson, blame me. I'm the one who gave him the numbers." Right? He was a quantitative analysis guy. He was a technocrat. Crunch numbers to win wars. That's not how you win wars. But to me, personally, the biggest culprit, the most deceitful, was Westmoreland, who kept telling McNamara, who then would tell LBJ, "Look, we're going to win this war. We can win this war. We're killing VC all the time. Body counts skyrocket, and that's how you determine if you're winning. How many people are killed? The body count." Well, those were all lies. And then Westmoreland would tell McNamara, "Listen, I got him on the run. I got him on the run. I just need a few thousand more troops." And then McNamara would crunch the numbers. Say, "Okay, Mr. President, based on my calculations, literally my calculations, to maintain the present kill ratio, and victory, we need 50,000 more troops." I'm making up numbers, but X number of troops. LBJ said, "But just 6 months ago, I authorized 10,000 more. Now you want 20,000 more? What's going on over there?" "Mr. President, there's light at the end of the tunnel. We got him on the run." Well, let me not digress, but let me segue into something that illustrates our stupidity. McNamara will be led to believe by Westmoreland CIA and other experts that the reason why we're not defeating the VC is because they control the countryside, they control the peasant population. That the majority of the peasants are supportive of the VC. That was not true. They didn't like the VC and they hated the VC as much as they hated us. The VC were vicious. They would use all kinds of just barbaric tactics to intimidate the local peasant population. Remember, you're looking at a country, and we forget this. Because Vietnam today is so modern and glitzy and glamorous and progressive and blah, 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 which is, yeah, fine, it is. You're looking at a population, a country in 1960s where 85 to 90% of the population lived in the countryside, were peasants living in small little villages and hamlets of a couple hundred people, right? Who have isolated and just want to be left alone. So what does Westmoreland McNamara decide to do? Implement, and you may have heard of this ridiculous policy. It was called the Strategic Hamlet Program. Ring a bell? Yeah, some of your listeners probably will know what I'm talking about. Whereby McNamara says, okay, if we need to separate the peasant population from the VC to minimize the VC's effectiveness, then we need a massive relocation program, whereby for about a year's time, I can't remember the duration of the program, we will literally massive relocate under this program hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese peasants. Relocate them into cities or larger urban areas, relocate them one part of the country to the other. You're going to uproot these people from their homelands where they've been for generations to protect them from the VC. Well, that's only going to further alienate an already alienated population from American policy. It was just a disaster. This is one of those programs that LBJ signs off on it. Like, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? This is a very traditional peasantry, not literate, right? Just very traditional, isolated, poor, right? They want to be left alone. And then you uproot them. And then you literally build a confine and put them in this, like, not a concentration camp, not an internment camp, but it was like an internment camp. And you put them there and we can protect them. The stupidity of it. It didn't last very long. I think it was in implementation for maybe a year or so, and then it realized what a disaster it was. And then you add to it the bombing of the bicycles. Let's go to that. LBJ beginning in 65, excuse me. You got Tonkin Gulf. That's a lie right there. Tonkin Gulf was a huge lie. I'm not going to go into that. Everybody knows about that. But that will give him the authority to take full control of the war. This is going to kill him. He will take, with the Tonkin Gulf resolution, Congress will give him full conduct of the war to do as he pleased with the war personally. Because since it's never declared war, right? Only Congress can declare war, joint session of Congress, House and Senate. LBJ gets around it with Tonkin Gulf, and you only had two senators, Wayne Morris of Oregon and Ernest Gooning of Alaska, who voted against Tonkin Gulf, saw this as a blatant usurpation of executive power. And LBJ, like a fool, believed he could win the war if he had full control of it. Well, the opposite's going to happen. It'll kill him, destroy him. So with Tonkin Gulf, Operation Rolling Thunder begins. And this is when the United States begins to bomb the shit out of North Vietnam to absolutely zero consequences for North Vietnam. You bomb a bridge one day, 3 days later, it's back up. This is the human bridges. This is the bicycle brigades. Ho Chi Minh will not relinquish. We believe, McNamara and the wise men all believe, Johnson too, that if we just bomb the shit out of North Vietnam, destroy all their ability to supply the VC, that they will give up. Never happened. They refused. They they knew. Ho Chi Minh and that leadership knew that they would win this war by attrition. That if we can just hang on forever and ever, long as we can, that the American people will turn against this war for a variety of reasons. And they were right. We turned against it. And the anti-war movement intensifies from 65 to 68. It will have an effect. Yeah, you bet it does. It does. LBJ, it got to him. He would call them those little campus shits and those lousy do-nothings and all that stuff, but he knew that it was having an effect. It's really interesting. Johnson was more afraid of pulling out of Vietnam and the criticism he would receive from the right, from the far right. He never saw the students coming. I mean, he did, but he didn't. He said, he'd tell advisors, I have one of the phone calls, oh, don't worry about those little campus shits. They're nobody. Well, we have to fear. He was talking with, speaking with McNamara and Rostow. What we really have to worry about is the right wing. They'll come after us. Republicans will come after us. We pull out of Vietnam. They're the hawks. Yeah, but but no. What the television? You can never relative to this war. Television is a huge factor in determining the outcome of this war. You put that war on TV every night, starts out 15, 20 minutes. By the time you get to 66, 67, you're talking about 45 minutes to an hour. You're going to start to run specials. And if you think about it, the real death blow is going to come from the media, is going to come from a man named Walter Cronkite.
America's dad.
Yeah. After the Tet Offensive, that was the final blow for Johnson, the Tet, end of January 68. Because he just gave his State of the Union address a couple weeks before. And based on what Westmoreland and McNamara's gone, based on what Westmoreland had told his new Secretary of State, Clark Clifford, that the war's over. Clifford had his doubts. But, okay, Mr. President, you can say that in your address. And based on that, he tells American public in his State of the Union that the war is winding down. We're on the verge of victory. Your sons will be coming home soon in the new year, blah, blah, blah. 2 weeks later, Tet. And you can watch that on television. They penetrate the American embassy. You've seen the footage. You got diplomats. You got, little clerks shooting their guns out the windows to keep the VC out. And then you have that dramatic execution of the Viet Cong guy. Americans have enough. They've had enough. Had enough. And this is what precipitates Johnson end of March to tell you he's not going to run for re-election. That was a blow. But Eugene McCarthy had already come out in November and announced he's going to run against Johnson. And then Bobby jumps in the bandwagon after McCarthy doesn't win, but almost wins in New Hampshire. And that's, whoa. And then Bobby jumps on the bandwagon. Bobby would have won. I mean, it was a tight race between Bobby and McCarthy, but he won in California. He would have got the nomination. He would have beaten Nixon. And he would have been president, but we'll never know.
What would you say the biggest takeaway of Vietnam is? Well, actually, let me ask you this. Who do you think had the most hope when it came to the Vietnam War? Either Kennedy, LBJ, or Nixon. Who did the most damage with processes of the Vietnam War? And then who would you say, I guess, has the most historical impact um, to how we remember the Vietnam War?
Oh, I'd say it's a '60s war, first of all, which is not correct, but that's the impression because you put it on television, and that thus, as the war intensifies and escalates, it's during Johnson's presidency. So forever, the history books, I'm being somewhat facetious, will write that war as Lyndon Johnson's war. It wasn't. He made it his war like a fool, but it wasn't exclusively his war. To blame him, this is me speaking personally, we cannot solely blame Johnson for that war because, like I said, at the beginning of the broadcast, our presence begins with Truman. That's what you're talking. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. You're talking 5 presidents, and not to beat up on Nixon, but I find him the biggest hypocrite of all. Johnson just was stupid at times. Man, so politically savvy, such a political animal. His biggest mistake is he just did not involve himself. Because I think if he really involved himself, and because he was a very sensitive guy, Johnson, overly sensitive. I think if he was more actively involved in the decision process and really took to heart these reports and saw the discrepancies, he would have got us out of there. I'm confident he would have. When, I don't know. He tells Doris Kearns this during his biography when she was doing his biography. He knew Nixon, being Nixon, was much more deceptive, much more deceitful. He campaigns on what? I'm going to end the war. You know, peace with honor. He during the campaign in '68, he tells the American people, we're so desperate to have an end to this war. He tells the American people, I'm going to end the war. Never says when. And remember, that war lasts 5 more years after he's elected. And the bombing reaches its all-time high point of devastation and death during Nixon's administration, not Johnson's. Nixon will drop more bombs in November, December, that 2 month period on North Vietnam than the entire Allied bombing of Germany during World War II. A tiny country, 1/50th the size of the United States. And you're talking millions will die. Millions died. Vietnamese, Southeast Asians. I mean, to me, that Nixon, I think he had the opportunity, but he's a cold warrior too. And he's getting advised by all these hardline cold warriors like Kissinger and others that we have to win this war. We have to win this war. And the Soviets are sitting back saying, fine, you can fight this war all you want. Brezhnev and those guys are happy as clams. Mao Zedong is happy as a clam because we're just depleting our power and image across the board. And I think Nixon sensed this. That's why his detente with China, with Mao, he goes over there, 71, 72, 71, and begins to de-escalate that. Nixon's not stupid, but he's a cold warrior. He's a cold warrior. Would I call LBJ a cold warrior? No, only by association, generational association. He's not a cold warrior. Kennedy, cold warrior. But Kennedy, remember, he's going to have his awakening with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And within a year's time after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he signs the nuclear test ban treaty in August of '63 with Khrushchev, because both those guys realized, whoa. Plus, motivating Khrushchev was the fact that he's at war with China. Soviets are at war with Chinese. So he doesn't want any problems with the U.S. At the same time, we're getting deeper and deeper into Vietnam. We want to minimize tensions with the Soviet Union. So there's reasons for that treaty as well. But overall, now I would say the war is Lyndon Johnson's war, sad but true. But let me reiterate, Nixon could have ended that war. He had the golden opportunity, but instead, what did he do? He escalates, he invades Cambodia, for God's sake, in the early spring of 70. The news of it doesn't hit until late spring 70, hence Kent State. But if you look at the anti-war movement, it kind of dies, just like stops all of a sudden with Nixon's few months in the White House because anti-war people, the student radicals have already imploded. SDS has imploded, but the anti-war movement's still going. And there's a lull because they believed, oh, Nixon's going to end the war. And then they find out he escalates it, and boom, then the massive protest, which results in Kent State. And Kent State's the final blow to the student radicals, because Nixon makes it pretty clear that I mean business with my law and order. I will shoot you now. And that's it. Kids go home. No, this is not what we bought it for. You're talking about, upper middle class, white, privileged kids who are the radicals. Well, once they're not going to throw up the barricades like the French do. No, we go home. Our kids go home.
I know we didn't really have a general thing besides just talking about Vietnam in this discussion. I appreciate where it went, and I appreciate your knowledge on the subject. I'm going to wrap it here just because there's obviously so many areas of Vietnam we could talk about, and I think a good generalization of the Kennedy administration, Nixon, and LBJ on the moves forward are very important to at least address, at least have people thinking a little bit more about LBJ, at least some of the fan base here, because a lot of people are Kennedy people. I'm not saying, again, we're not admonitoring or whatever, admiring any of the bad qualities of LBJ. There are those qualities, but they're like that in everything. I think just more balanced approach. Listening to these phone calls illuminates a little bit more about the certain whispers in the ear. I think I've had more people discuss a deep state or establishment type idea was the clear presence of the Vietnam thing. A lot of people addressed that this was something that was obviously the war machine was getting fueled. And it was like, yeah, it's again, it's a complicated subject, but I appreciate your time, Mr. Moretta. Is there a place where people can find your links and also any book links, social media links?
Oh, just go on Amazon, or Google. I'm there. You can find anything you want on Google.
I will link all your old other links that I put in other episode descriptions in this description as well too. And I appreciate your time again. I always enjoy our chats. I look forward to our next one when your book comes a little bit closer to coming out.
Yeah. All right. Good talking, buddy.
Yep. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.